Um, so before I get started, I would like a really quick show of hands so we understand the audience a little bit better. So who does any sort of data processing or anything that could be considered big data? All right, so it's about like 20%, 30%. Who does something around smaller data but does analytics nonetheless and uses the data to some degree? All right, so about, let's say, 40% altogether, maybe 50%. All right. So I won't get into all the, what big data means. Everybody knows what that is. It's been way past the stage of hype. It's now actually, well into production for a lot of companies. And because of that, and as with any great technology, there is a lot of side effects. There is a lot of good that comes from it, but also there is a lot of potential bad because of its immense power that it has. And what the European Commission has tried to do is actually try to get it decided that we are now at the point where we need to regulate this business. We need to regulate what people can do with data because of the immense power that this data has and the immense power that algorithms have on our daily lives. And I will give you some examples of what this actually means. So you've seen this before. By the way, I'm not going to ask who has heard of GDPR, but who has read a little bit more in depth about GDPR? All right, okay, so that's about 50%. So GDPR will come, it's actually, it has been approved, and it will come into effect in May 2019. And to give you a feel of why this is important, on their official website, there's a little timer here. And it just decrements all the way to zero. So it's really important. They say it's the biggest change in 20 years around data regulation. All right, so about myself, I'm a technical person, not a lawyer by any stretch of imagination. I'm passionate around this high performance and big data region. And everything that I'm going to say, it comes from this perspective of a technical person. Right, so if you do have questions about the technologies that I'm talking about the principles that I'm talking about, I would really like you guys to stop me and raise your hand and ask me right there, because I hate giving sort of TED Talks. Right, I want to have a conversation so stop me at any time. I think we'll have enough time. So a disclaimer, again, I'm not a lawyer. Everything that I say is my own interpretation, but I did talk to some lawyers around this, and I did study it a little bit better, but did seek professional advice if you get into it before you commit resources. Right, so you've heard about 20 million euros, and this is actually not effective. So 20 million euros or 4% of the global revenue, whichever is greater. I think that's really important for big businesses as well as small businesses. It's really, really, it is important to pay attention to it. And I was talking about why and how big data and algorithms in general affect the general public, and why the European Commission has decided to invest and to regulate this business. And this is the first example. It looks like artificial intelligence amplifies bias that already exists in society. So if a data set contains reactions of people that are discriminatory in nature, so will the algorithm that you build on top of it. You will have a racist AI, right? So to give you an example of how this works is that there has been a study from Harvard University that what they did is they took these about 2,000 names that have black-sounding names, actually, and white-sounding names. And they searched them on Google, and they've seen that the ads that Google shows are more likely to have references to arrests being made if you're a black person. So what this tells you is that the society sees black persons a lot more associated with arrests and bad things being done than white folks. This is present in the algorithms and in the ads that get displayed by Google. So Google actually has sort of an algorithm that amplifies the social bias. There's another form of social bias, and it's due to the lack of data about a specific category of people. And there's this very, very smart app called Street Bum. Basically, it uses the accelerometer and the GPS of your smartphone, and as you move through the cities, especially in Boston, it automatically detects a pothole, right, and registers it and sends it over to the authorities so that it can get fixed. But a problem with this smart app is that it showed that lower income areas, as well as places where elderly people live, have no potholes, which of course is false. It's the fact that we don't have data from there because they don't use smartphones. They don't afford smartphones, or didn't at that time at least. So not having information about a particular category, if you only rely on data and if you do not try to do something actively to stop that, it will affect your reactions to it. So this is an example of good application that makes you forget about certain categories. So you always have, as a designer of big data technologies and a big data infrastructure, you need to always think about who lives in the shadow of your big data. All right. So again, algorithms affect reputation a lot. So there have been two lawsuits that were won by the people in Germany. There's the German businessman that discovered that when you type his name in in Google, the suggestions for the search, automatically autocomplete suggestions include his name and Scientology, fraud, and others. And as a businessman, that affected him, right? So he wanted that to be removed from there because it had nothing to do with Scientology or fraud cases. It's just a coincidence. And the same was for the wife of a former president that was associated with escort services, right? So you don't want that sort of stuff because basically in these particular situations, algorithms affected the reputation of this individual. So they wanted that data to be deleted and removed. So this is why GDPR, the European Commission, introduced all the rights that citizens now have, and we're going to talk about them later on. And there's also a lot of mistrust. This is the last slide with the examples like this, but this shows you that there's a lot of mistrust in who handles personally identifiable information. And I don't know if you noticed it, this is single digit, right? So people don't actually trust websites with their personal information at all. It's single digit, they don't. But they're bullied into giving it because unless you give it, you cannot interact with the website. And up until this point, you either give them the information and you sign a waiver by continuing, I agree, and then, because that's it. You don't have any other option. So what GDPR tries to do is change this. It wants to give people the option to avoid this, and we're going to show you how exactly. So it introduces a few rights for the citizens, right? So the right of access, which means we need to be able to, and this, I've chosen everything that has to do with big data, because if I build a big data infrastructure, I want to be able, I need to know that my users, the users that data I hold in my databases have these rights, and I need to be able to support them. So I need to be able to explain what I do with the data. So I cannot just collect click streams anymore from my website and not tell the customers what I'm doing with them. So I need to be able to explain I'm collecting them because I want to give you a better service. I need to be able to give our customers the ability to allow to choose what to do with that particular data. So if I know that you're going to target me with targeted ads, I need to be able to say no, right? And this is really important. Also, I need, and this is irrelevant for the big data set, I need, as a customer, I want you to tell me all the data that I have, that you have on me right now, everything, right? So this line here, which is really important because it means I got to go into all my 50 systems, production systems, and download all the data that's pertaining to a particular user, including logs, everything. So I need to be able to put it on a hard drive and give it to the customer. So this is really important because right now I don't think enterprises actually have a good way of tracking what the data is. Okay, and the right to be forgotten, which I've exemplified. Basically, you want the vendor to delete everything that you have on the service, or to actually, I want my Facebook profile together with all my images ported over to High5 because I don't want to be locked into Facebook. I don't like Facebook anymore. So why should have Facebook own the data that I generated? So this is what the GDPR's perspective on things. And it also introduces several obligations, right? So privacy by design is something that's really important. The rest are also important, but the privacy by design will have changes in the way we architect big data infrastructure from the get-go, because I need to be able to secure by design, by the architecture, right when I'm putting data into a data lake, the information before I actually use it. So you don't just secure the perimeter around the big data infrastructure. Right, so again, all these rights, the new rights that citizens have and obligations that vendors have are complicated in big data environments. And it is because the GDPR forces you to tell the user what you're going to do with the data. But in big data situations, big data scenarios, that's typically not the case. You don't know what you're going to do with the data, right? You have no business goal set. You explore the data, and then you come up with an idea. So you cannot just, you don't know a priori. It's a chicken and the egg problem. Also, algorithms are often black box, right? It's very hard to explain a random forest to non-technical people and how it works. Very few people actually understand what a decision tree is. So it's very hard. Also, big data, you typically, up until this point, it was sort of a practice to get, to just retain everything in big data, because the cost of retaining everything was less than the cost of eliminating stuff that you don't need. So it's cheaper to just capture it all. But GDPR stops you from doing that. You gotta only gather the data that you need and you have a legitimate use for, or you get consent from the customer. So not everything, only what you need. So that's problematic. And also the data gets repurposed. So right now I'm capturing it to be able to send you a bill, and I need your address. But next I'm going to use your address to put you in an area so that I can keep my representative closer. So I'm using it for a different purpose, right? And we do have use of profiling. And there's, the last part of the presentation is going to talk a little bit more about profiling. Profiling is clearly regulated in the GDPR as we move forward. It explains how and in which conditions you can do profiling, and what the data looks like that you can base your profiling on. So we will need, as we design algorithms, we will need to be very attentive on how we do this so that we do it legally. Because otherwise the fines are tremendous. And there are authorities in each country that supervise this sort of stuff, and you need to be able to explain what happens to them. You got to have documentation. So it's important to know all this stuff. So, quick technical solution for, let's say, everybody that starts right now with a blank slate in an organization and wants to be GDPR compliant. My suggestion would be to first set up a data laboratory, because it helps you see and explore the data that you currently have. You get the data from all your 15 data sources, you put it in the data lake. You got to have a data lake that's versatile enough to hold various formats, from logs to structured data, and we typically use HDFS and Parquet. And you need to be able to look at it and do a little bit of correlations before you go out and you talk to your customers and ask for consent, because you don't want to always update the terms of use and conditions, right? So you need to explore your data to understand it better, to see what the potential uses will be before you get consent from your customer. So I would set this up, and I will look at how my data works. And we can talk more about this if you're interested. What's really important is to have a meta store for your data, because this helps the data that's stored in Parquet be available to both data scientists in Jupyter and business intelligence interface like ClickView or Superset or Tableau. Because if a data scientist will create a table, you want it to be immediately available on the other side. So in an Apache Spark-based infrastructure, you want that Apache Spark to write it into the metastore, because the metastore holds the tables, which files in HDFS, which is a dumb store, represent the table and where that table resides and which files it contains. But also there's the black box here, the black rectangle with Apache Atlas. That's also really important. Who knows what Apache Atlas means? Have you heard it? There's nobody. So we're going to talk about it. But that's what I call a meta store, right? A metadata store. So besides the data laboratory, which everybody does in some form or another, right? With various technologies, which some of them are open source and some of them are not. What you need right now, and what has been suggested many times, to be built in big data infrastructures, but I think now with GDPR is becoming more and more important, is to have a data provenance and data lineage store. So sort of a documentation for your data. So whenever you connect the 50 data sources to your data lake, you need to document, the fact that the data comes from those places, which table from which location, what does a particular field mean, so that whenever you create new refreshes of the data, or when you create a derived data, right, you create another additional table as composed out of multiple ones, you need to know what are all the, the chain of the data. So this has become a lot more important in GDPR because it's the same meta store that will help you identify the data sources when you need to delete the information from, as well as download all the information from. So you keep your data in your production systems as they are right now, but you need this in order to map everything. So this sort of catalog will be required as we move forward. And if you're doing big data, you need to start doing this properly. And Apache Atlas is the only open source meta store or data governance tool that I know of. There are many others that I've listed before, like Informatica and Talend and all the others, which are all commercial. But this is the only one that's open source. It doesn't have tremendous integration because, a side effect of having this data in this catalog is that you can block data access, right? So you can also use it as a, security engine, as a access validation engine, or at least an audit, so you have a ledger of who accessed what data and when, which is good for audits and security tests. But currently it doesn't work with Spark, but I would give that up for using Spark. Right, so again, since we are on the track of security, my approach to security in the big data business is that you should not hold personally identifiable information at all, and you should strip the information if it's identifiable, if you can, because then it doesn't belong to anybody. You don't have to protect it. So in the event of a leak, you still keep it. It's not as bad as if you leak data with emails and phone names. So for big data purposes, for statistical purposes, you can work just with the statistical characteristics of the data, right? So for the data population. So how do you keep your data so that it's still useful to you, so you can still do do the analysis that you currently do, but at the same time keep the data anonymous? And again, having an anonymized data set doesn't guarantee anonymity, by the way. There have been a lot of incidents where supposedly anonymized data has been re-identified. And this typically happens when you take an anonymized data set that has no ID or username or name or something that uniquely identifies an individual, but you correlate it with an external data set, right? That's really easy to do. And for instance, there is a research that says that if you have only 2 IP addresses, you can uniquely identify an individual, because most of the time you access a website from your home and from your office. Very few people have these 2 characteristics in common with you. So this means you need to make sure that you remove from your data sets information that could lead to re-identification, right? So various ways of doing that. Masking, of course, is one way, which is a naive way. It works, but it does provide some level of information. And to give you an example, we had the previous talk, I don't know if you've noticed, it has the name of the bank, of the website name of the bank, it was hashed over. But you could still see some elements there. You could see how many characters were in the name of the bank, right? Which means, how many banks there are in Romania right now. How many banks have that number of characters in their name? And I bet you there are 1 or 2. So it's a lot easier to de-anonymize something if you know something about the data. So masking works, but it's not brilliant, but it's something that you start with. Pseudonymation is basically you change something with my name, Alex, with Jon Snow, right? It's funny, but it's not really secure, but it does help a little bit. But what you can do, and now it starts getting a little bit better, is you add a little bit of noise to the data set, right? So instead of having my height precisely measured at what I have, the minute details, you randomize a little bit, so that it's not as easy to identify. So like in that hashing, you could do a longer hash, and then put arrow at the end, so that you cannot infer how many letters there are. So this little bit of noise helps. And I'm going to talk about differential privacy, which uses this principle a lot better. So sampling means it is a lot harder to re-identify something, to re-identify a user, if you don't know if it's present in the database. So how you do this is that you basically just keep part of the data set, so that you only have, you don't know for sure if that particular individual is in the data set. That makes it a lot harder for somebody to re-anonymize. Rounding, again, so you can just use 2%. It's just as good from a statistical standpoint than 1.945, but it removes that specificality, right? Generalization, it basically means you got to make sure that there's actually something called K anonymity. It means making sure that at least K individuals from the data set share your characteristics. And the way to do that is to basically either add characteristics or remove characteristics. And then differential privacy. Actually, I'm going to talk about differential privacy and come back to stream sets. Apple has recently introduced this method of protecting the data that you generate using your iPhone. So what it means is that they add randomness to everything that you do. So they collect data as you move across the world and as you give phone calls, but they add randomness to it at the source in your iPhone, so that if somebody leaks that particular data set, it is much harder to identify you precisely, because your GPS coordinates are not exactly the same. There's a little bit, the circle is wider, so it's harder for somebody to re-identify. So how can you do that if you're a normal person? You must make sure that you preserve the characteristics of your population from a statistical standpoint. And there's a tool from Google called Rapport that helps you do that. It helps you calculate how much randomness can you add to the data source, so that you keep your characteristics of your data set useful but anonymized, right? Sorry. Yeah, so this is a tool that we like a lot and we use a lot. It's called stream sets. And I don't know if have you heard about it? All right, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. So we love it. We love it specifically because it's very good for real-time scenarios. So whenever we push data from a website or we push data from a database in real time through Kafka or through something else, it has all these blocks which are very, very easy to use, right? A field mask, a field remover, a field hasher, which gives you an MD5 of the particular field. And it's very easy at the border of your data lake to anonymize the data at the source. At least do some efforts to anonymize it at the source. So you use this, it's very easy to set up. It also helps you move the data. So we set up, whenever we go to a customer, we set up a stream sets flow for each source of data, and it helps you protect the data as well as import the data. Right, so, and these are my last 2 slides. And they are about profiling, which is really important. As I've told you, it's now a little bit more regulated. So in which sense? Oh, by the way, who recognizes this, this image here? Come on. Any data scientists in the room? No? So this is a random forest presentation. These are decision trees, and these are all the trees in the forest. Anyway, so it's hard to explain. If I start talking about how it works, it's going to take some time. But I will need to be able to do that once we move into GDPR, at least to some degree. So what rights do the data subjects, as they are called, have? So first of all, you cannot do profiling without their consent if there is any legal effect. And to give you an example of that, if there's an automated process saying you cannot access an insurance policy, or you cannot access healthcare, or you cannot access, and your premium goes up just because you're older, or you've been identified by an automatic application that you reside in a low-income area, hence you're probably low income, hence you cannot afford for treatment, and then you have higher incidence of whatever. you have the right to object to it and stop the profiling happening, and you have the right to ask for a human intervention to remove it. So another example is ING's way of calculating whether you can get credit or not just based on the financial data that it gets from the authorities. That's all good and fine, but you now have the right to stop that and say, I want a human to look at this. Okay, so another explicitly defined characteristics of everything that's GDPR related is direct marketing, which doesn't necessarily mean only emails. Also means targeted ads. So it means that you need explicit consent for direct marketing. Explicit meaning you cannot have that box ticked. It needs to be unticked, and it needs to be clearly defined what I'm going to use the data for, how I'm going to do profiling, and everything. And you need to be able to explain the reasoning behind the particular algorithm. And again, it's very, very important to design the algorithm in such a manner that it prevents discrimination, either by the basis of the data set itself, try to remove the bias if it exists, but also try to prevent people that are discriminated from being discriminated by your algorithm. So you got to think about this sort of stuff and try to think whether religion has something to do with the results of the profiling, not incorporate religion. It might improve your accuracy, right? It's really important. It improves your accuracy a lot, but it's illegal because it will affect certain populations negatively. But you can still do it, provided all these things are accounted for. So again, profiling, you can do profiling, but you also need the data that you base your profiling to be properly obtained. So what this means is that, by the way, personal information also means observed data and inferred data, not just data that has been punched in directly by the customer. It also means his behavior on your website. That's also personally identifiable information, by the way. And you need to be able to collect that with the consent, or if there's something called legitimate use. Legitimate use, how much time do I still have? It's like 2 minutes, okay, 2 minutes. So legitimate use is you gotta be able to prove that you cannot run your business without that particular information. Unless that's present, then you cannot claim legitimate use. So, it depends on the authority whether you can claim it or not, and there is an authority in Romania which you can now go and consult and ask, hey, is this legitimate use? Because if I have legitimate use, I don't need consent from the customers. In all other cases, I need consent. And consent needs to be clearly obtained. So you remember the slide with trust, right? With the 10,000, 300 pages long terms of use and conditions, things that we all sign and nobody reads. Well, we will not be able to have that anymore. We are forced to clearly explain what the rights are. And so that's not permitted anymore. What has been suggested is that the internet will need to start looking more like label, the back of medicine. You need to have clearly defined information, and they talk about adding icons, which are standard across the industry, so that the user can say, hey, I allow geolocation-based profiling to occur, but I don't allow, name-based profiling to occur. It is important that we think, when we design the big data application or the profiling algorithm, that we need to be able to remove somebody from the audience, right? Or at least protect them. That's it. I'm all ears.
Thank you, Alex. Do you have questions for him? Yes, there's one there. Meanwhile, do you speak Klingon?
No, I don't, unfortunately. But I've seen a lot of, legalese, which sort of resembles Klingon in many terms of use and conditions that nobody reads because of that. So we need to change it. And one comment on that, if you want to see an example on how the new terms of use and condition pages will look like, try to look at Channel 4. So Channel 4 has on the website, they've turned this into marketing gimmick, and they actually have movies with somebody explaining how, what their promise is to their users. So you can actually use this to your advantage if you do it properly. So it doesn't have to be a burden. It can be something good for you. So try to take a look at that.
Hi.
Please.
Just a quick question. So you were mentioning removing data. and one of the parts was logging. So what happens? So let's assume you have some audit logs. Somebody can come in and actually ask for the removal of that data.
Yes.
So how do you use that from a security standpoint then? So
That's the provision. There's it depends on the legitimate use of that particular data, first of all. If you are required to keep it for legal means, for instance, or you want to use it you had a security incident and you want to keep the records in your database pertaining a particular security audit, then there's a provision in GDPR saying that you can keep it.
Okay, so you can keep it.
Yes, but only in these circumstances. If it helps you prevent or react after a security incident, because you'll need to report it. Remember, so reporting also means you got to know what to report. And so yeah, you're actually forced to keep it. You're not, you will not. You will say no, I don't want to delete it because I need it for this purpose.
And do you need to inform the customer about that?
And you need to inform the customer about it. So
Okay.
it's actually a little bit more complicated because nowadays a lot of vendors are interconnected with each other, right? So there's such a thing called a controller, which designs what or says what needs to be done with the particular data, and then there's an operator, right? So Google Analytics is an operator for somebody, but that particular company is the controller, controls what happens. So Google Analytics will need to report a breach to the controller, and then the controller will need to report it to the authorities.
Okay.
So yeah, you can keep the logs in that particular situation, but if there has been no breach, you'll need to delete it.
Okay.
Did I answer your question? Okay. So I think there's one there.
There are a couple more questions, yes. I do speak Klingon.
You do?
Kapla.
Kapla, yeah. Wow.
Hi,
Cool.
Alex. Quick question regarding the data scientist job. Let's say, how do you think it will change with the regulatory aspects that need to be implemented in all the big data systems around the world, or at least in Europe?
That's a good question. So how will the data scientist
You
job
cannot
change
just play
afterwards?
around. The initial job description of data scientist. You come and play around and play. Apply
Yes,
any math
yes, yes.
to.
So I think it will change in the sense that it will need to learn to work with that person called Chief Protection Officer. So they will need to be aware of the risks and implications of the fact that they work with powerful stuff. So it's like operating heavy machinery, right? With somebody that operates like this bulldozer, they know that they can run somebody down, tear buildings down. They know they have great power on their hands. So they will need to be, it's not just data on their, little R studio application in their little data set. There's a lot of power in that. So they need to have some responsibility. But they need to also learn, what that means. And there is a person that we will all need to have in our organization, this Chief Data Protection Officer, to whom to address questions and he will have he or she will have the responsibility to instruct data scientists on how to behave, if you want. Did I answer your question? Okay.
Last question.
Hi. Regarding the data generated by your own infrastructure that is actually a derivative of the user data, how far along does this go in?
So GDPR has specific considerations about derived and informed data. Derived is by observing a customer move through the website. So you look at your own data has been generated, but because it can identify a user, as I've told you before, by the data that's anonymized, and it can identify if it can identify to some degree what a particular user has done and the past purchases, behavior, and that's sensitive. Like imagine you run, I don't know, something that has to do with the sexuality and sexual orientation of the person. You just, if the guy buys a lot of dildos, for instance, there's not an information that that guy will want it to be leaked to the audience. That has a lot of, damaging potential impact. So that becomes such personal data that you need to.
So essentially, as long as you cannot put an ID on a specific data, then you're fine with the data.
Not specifically, because as I said before, you can re-identify people, even without an ID, just because of the characteristics. But there are shades of gray around this area. right? So the further away it is from being able to re-identify a particular person from a data set, the better you are from a compliance standpoint. But just saying, I don't have an ID, it's not enough. That's what I'm trying to say.
No, when I say ID, I mean data that can, any data that can identify a specific person.
Yes, yes, yes. So the ID of a person in a particular database
being,
or something. Yeah.
Street address, name, or everything that can
so
link.
personal identifiable information in that data
Yeah.
set. So as I said before, if by correlating with another data set, you cannot re-identify a person in your data set, then you're fine.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex.